Hello everybody, this is Kate at the Library of Whispers, and today I'm going to do a soft-spoken reading from one of these lovely Ladybird books, Adventure from History. It's the story of Napoleon. It's a very old book, vintage. I'm sure we'll find out what date it is when we look. So there's some illustrations of various soldiers. He's a lancer, an artillery officer, a gunner, infantry sergeant, officers, cavalry, various weapons, scabbard, trooper's sword, musket, bayonet. Okay, so this book was published in 1968 in Loughborough in England. Here he is on his white horse. Napoleon Bonaparte was one of the two greatest soldiers the world has ever known. The other was Alexander the Great, who died more than 2,000 years before Napoleon was born, and about whom you may read in another book in this series. As well as being a great general, Napoleon made many of the laws under which France is governed today. Napoleon had more energy, more intelligence, and a better brain than any other man in Europe. He was also able to work for 20 hours a day with only 4 hours sleep. All this, combined with his ability to decide instantly and correctly what to do, either in a battle or a council chamber, enabled him, a poor boy from Corsica, to become Emperor of France and Master of Europe at the age of 35. In 1768, the island of Corsica became part of France, and a year later Charles and Letizia Bonaparte had a son, their second, whom they christened Napoleon. These names are Italian, because Corsica previously belonged to Italy. Napoleon later changed the spelling to the French form which we know today, and by which he will always be known to history. We know very little about Napoleon's childhood. Corsica was a small island, and the Corsican people were mostly untaught peasants in revolt against their new French masters. Napoleon's father and later Napoleon himself were involved in a rebellion which failed. For a time they were obliged to leave the island. Charles Bonaparte was related to a family which had belonged to the nobility of Tuscany in Italy. A friend of the family, Count de Marbeuf, was able to help him to get a grant to send the young Napoleon to a military school at Brienne in France. He did not have a very happy time at school. He has been described as gloomy and not good at games. In addition, he spoke French with a strong Corsican accent and was despised by the boys from rich French families because he was poor. Napoleon was not a brilliant scholar. He was good at mathematics, and he liked history and geography, but he had a wonderful memory, and all his life he was always able to remember everything he read or heard. When it came to designing fortifications or planning military exercises, he was far better than any of the other boys. Because Napoleon was so good at mathematics, he was sent to the artillery school in Paris, where his mathematics master reported that he was one of the most intelligent pupils he had ever had. In everything else, he failed to distinguish himself. He was posted to the La Fère regiment of artillery as a sub-lieutenant, and this was the beginning of his wonderful career as the greatest military commander of his time. Napoleon was now 16, and the year was 1785. In those days, cannon were nothing like the accurate long-range guns of today. They fired solid cannonballs, and also what was called grape shot. This was like modern shrapnel, and consisted of a lot of small balls about the size of golf balls, which scattered and could therefore kill or wound a lot of people at one shot. Although soldiers in those days wore wonderful uniforms, Sub-Lieutenant Bonaparte could not have looked very distinguished. He was short, very thin, and far from strong, and with a sallow complexion, saved by handsome features and brilliant eyes. Napoleon still thought of himself as a Corsican, rather than a Frenchman, but he was now a captain in the French army, and he was sent to put down a rising in Corsica, led by a patriotic Corsican named Paoli. This meant a final break with Corsica, and Napoleon was obliged to remove his mother and her family to France. Madame Bonaparte was a woman of strong character and determination. With her young children, she managed to evade the followers of Paoli, who tried to capture her. The refugees had lost everything, and had only Napoleon's pay on which to live. But at this point, his elder brother Joseph married the daughter of a rich merchant, somewhat against her father's wishes. If he had known that she would one day be the Queen of Spain, he might not have objected so strongly. Napoleon wished to marry another daughter, but this time the father refused. When, only 11 years later, Napoleon became Emperor of France, he was probably sorry that he had turned down the young captain of artillery. This daughter later married one of Napoleon's generals, Bernadotte, and became Queen of Sweden. Bernadotte retained his throne, and his descendant is King of Sweden today. The French Revolution had broken out in 1789, and France became a republic 3 years later. The king had been murdered, and the armies of all the European countries were gathering to avenge his death. Some parts of France were still against the new government. One of these was the port of Toulon, where the citizens had called in the assistance of some English warships. These were anchored in the harbour. The French generals were unable to decide how to attack the town. They were not prepared to listen to the advice of a young captain of artillery. It was not until they were replaced by a general with more experience that Napoleon was given the opportunity which changed his life and was to affect all Europe. Captain Bonaparte, by which name the future emperor was then of course known, was put in command of the artillery. He had, from the first, insisted that the guns should be mounted on a promontory which commanded the harbour. This was now done, and Napoleon set up braziers to make the cannonballs red hot. When these started falling amongst them, the English ships left the harbour. Without their help, Toulon surrendered. On the fall of Toulon, Napoleon was promoted to brigadier. This was rapid promotion, for a young man of only 24. Many older soldiers were jealous of him, and many of the politicians distrusted him, but he was too useful an officer to be neglected. Napoleon was next sent to the French army opposing the Austrians in northern Italy. The French generals were again incompetent, and when Napoleon arrived, they at first refused to listen to him. When they did, there was an immediate change. At the military school, the young Napoleon had read a book on military tactics, which he had never forgotten. It laid down the rules for anyone commanding an army, to choose a point of attack, and at that point to be stronger than the enemy, and secondly, always to try to surprise the enemy by moving swiftly from one place to another. By always remembering these two rules, Napoleon won one campaign after another, until it seemed he was invincible. Added to swiftness of movement, Napoleon possessed the ability to look at a map and at once to know how and where to move his soldiers to surprise the enemy. Napoleon returned from Italy to find that his friends in the government had been replaced, and that he himself was out of favour. He was offered the command of some soldiers fighting against a part of France, the Vendée, which did not recognise the revolutionary government. Napoleon refused, saying that he was an artilleryman and knew nothing about commanding infantry. This sounds strange, coming from the man who was later to command hundreds of thousands of victorious infantrymen all over Europe. It was at this point, in 1795, that the whole future, not only of Napoleon, but of a score of European countries, including England, might have been changed. The Sultan of Turkey was asking for French artillery officers to help in organising his army. Napoleon was tempted and applied for permission to go. He was refused. Napoleon's fortunes seemed to be at a very low ebb. He was poor, out of favour, and often hungry. He even had to sell his watch to buy food. Then, as had happened before in his career, his luck changed overnight. His friend Barras, a politician but no soldier, found himself facing civil war in Paris. He sent for Napoleon, whom he remembered from the capture of Toulon. The Armed Revolt, organised by the Royalists, that is, those who were in favour of a monarchy, was a serious one. They had 30,000 men ready to attack, and the Convention, which was the name of the French government, had only 8,000, but Napoleon Bonaparte was in command of them. There was what we call a gun park at a place named Sablons, and the Royalists determined to capture it. They sent a battalion to seize the guns, but Napoleon got there first. He had no mercy. As soon as the Royalists appeared, he opened fire with grape shot, and hundreds were killed. The rest ran away. At other points in Paris, such as the famous Pont Royal, Napoleon dispersed the Royalists, and by doing so earned the grateful thanks of the Convention. He was now well established, but he wanted again to prove himself, where he knew he could do more, and do it better than any other French general. The war against Austria was not going well. Napoleon, who was now on friendly terms with the members of the government, met and talked with the minister who was in charge of military affairs. He applied to be sent to Italy to command the army. The Minister for War, Carnot, agreed. General Bonaparte was to go to Italy in supreme command, but first something was to happen which later became of very great importance: his marriage. As an out-of-work officer in disgrace, he had met Josephine de Beauharnais. When he returned to her the sword of her husband, who had been killed in the French Revolution. She was 6 years older than Napoleon, and was at first scornful of the shabby young officer. Barras was also a friend of Josephine de Beauharnais, and he assured her that the young General Bonaparte was very far from being as bad a match as he looked. Barras realised that here was a man not to be judged by the shabby coat and the lank, straggling hair, which we see in existing portraits of Napoleon at 26. Barras was far from knowing to what heights Napoleon would rise in less than 10 years, but he said enough to make Josephine de Beauharnais believe that this was a man worth marrying. The marriage took place, and although, for reasons of state, Napoleon was later to divorce her, he never ceased to love her to the end of his life. When General Bonaparte arrived in Italy, the older generals looked with disdain on the thin young man whom the politicians in Paris had put in command over them. They soon changed their minds. Napoleon found the French army in very poor condition. Half the men were in rags, and all very hungry. None had been paid for months. He began by promising to lead them to a land of plenty, where everything would be theirs to take. Honour, fame, and wealth were waiting if they had the courage to fight for it. The words put new heart into the hungry soldiers. They saw that here was a man very different from the old generals who were content merely to let things drift. Napoleon could be curt and masterful with his generals, but never with his soldiers. He went amongst them as a friend, remembered many of their names, and asked after their families. No general had ever done anything like this before, and they became devoted to him. His courage won their respect. In a battle at Lodi, it was necessary to get command of a bridge. The Austrian bombardment was terrible, but Napoleon brought up his guns and even loaded them himself. The French soldiers, used to seeing their generals keep well out of danger, were amazed to see their new commander acting as a gunner. What was more, he knew exactly what to do and how to do it. After Lodi, he was known throughout the army as Le Petit Caporal, the Little Corporal. The soldiers had adopted him as one of themselves. It was the highest honour of all. Napoleon followed the tactics which were always his sure way to victory. He divided the enemy forces and by swift marches struck at their weakest points. Soon the Austrians were driven out of Italy and forced to make peace. To gain a victory in Italy was important, but Napoleon knew that to the politicians in Paris a victory was only important if it brought financial and other gains. He took care of his men, and he never forgot the politicians. The French treasury was almost empty. Napoleon made the beaten enemy pay more than 60 million francs, which he sent back to France. This was to make him popular with the government, so that the people of France should also have cause to thank him. He enriched their art galleries and museums with the loot of priceless treasures. Napoleon had become the most famous man in France, but when he returned, he knew that the politicians were not only jealous of his popularity, but were afraid of him. He realised, however, that the time had not yet come for him to overthrow them, and he kept himself very much in the background. In the treaty with Austria, what is now Belgium had been given to France. This meant that the whole of the coast opposite Dover would be in French hands. The English government under the famous Prime Minister Pitt could not agree to this and refused to recognise the treaty. England was therefore still at war with France. The French government decided to invade England and sent Napoleon to Boulogne to report on the proposal. They thought it would also be a good way of getting him out of Paris. Napoleon spent 3 weeks at Boulogne. He realised that the idea of invading England was quite impossible, whilst the English fleet was in command of the Channel. He reported that the crossing would take 7 or 8 hours, and would only be possible during the hours of darkness. Preparations were, however, continued in order to deceive the English. Meanwhile, Napoleon had suggested another way of striking at England. He proposed to conquer Egypt and close the route to India. This would hit English trade with the East and would, he hoped, force England to ask for peace. It was a dangerous operation. Nelson was in the Mediterranean with a fleet, and Napoleon well knew that the French ships were no match for the English fleet. In addition, there would be unarmed ships carrying an army of 40,000 men. In spite of this, the French expedition sailed on May the 19th, 1798, and landed safely in Egypt. Nelson had missed it by 5 miles in the darkest hour of a short May night. Once ashore, Napoleon soon won a battle near the Great Pyramids and entered Cairo 2 months after landing. However, in August, Nelson found the French fleet at anchor in Aboukir Bay and destroyed it. Napoleon and the French army were now cut off from France. In other books in this series you can read all about Nelson and the destruction of the French fleet, also about the famous Rosetta Stone, which Napoleon brought back with him when he managed to return to France a year and a half later. Napoleon was again fortunate. He sailed in a small frigate in October 1799 and slipped through the English fleet unseen. He landed in France to be received everywhere as the man who would save the Republic. There was good reason for this. All his conquests in Italy had been lost by incompetent generals, and there was disorder and discontent at home. The men who should have been governing the country were all plotting one against another. The Royalists were hoping to restore the monarchy, and a German army was threatening invasion. Once again, Napoleon waited until the right moment. Then, with the aid of a famous Frenchman named Talleyrand, he dismissed the members of the government. Within weeks, Napoleon, with the title of First Consul, was master of France. He used his new powers well, and much that he did remains to this day. He drew up a new code of laws, known as the Code Napoleon, and he founded the Bank of France. Another thing which owes its beginning to Napoleon is the Order of the Légion of Honour, still today the highest honour to which a Frenchman can attain. Most of all, he restored order and good government. The people of France were weary of war. They wanted peace, and they hoped that fear of Napoleon would prevent any country from attacking them. They were wrong. Pitt refused to make peace, and assisted with large sums of money from England. Austria again put an army in the field. Napoleon was forced to march against the Austrians. 7 months after becoming first consul, Napoleon led an army across the great St. Bernard Pass. Thousands of men, horses and mules had to struggle against terrible conditions. Napoleon wrote, "We are battling against ice, snow, gales and avalanches." Encouraged by their indomitable general, who shared all their hardships, the army crossed the pass and came down on Italy, as Napoleon further wrote, like a thunderbolt. Napoleon never forgot he had been an artillery officer. Always he supported his attacks with heavy gunfire. The guns had all to be dismantled and dragged over the pass on wooden sledges by hundreds of men. Napoleon determined to march on Milan, the capital of northern Italy. But first he had to meet and destroy the Austrian army. The Battle of Marengo was fought and won in June, one of the most difficult and hard-fought battles of Napoleon's career. In the year 1800, Napoleon was 31 and had already twice made the Austrian emperor beg for peace. He returned to France, more than ever the hero of the people, only to find that the politicians had been plotting against him. They had hoped that he would be killed in Italy. When he rode into Paris very much alive, they scattered and fled. Peace with Austria was followed a year later by the Treaty of Amiens, signed by England. Neither side believed that it would last. The English fleet held the sea, but Napoleon was victorious on land. Neither trusted the other. Nor did Napoleon trust the men whom he had forced to give up the government of France. He knew that when his term as first consul came to an end, they would be fighting amongst themselves to succeed him. France might well be plunged into civil war. There was only one thing to be done, and Napoleon did not hesitate. He had narrowly escaped assassination, supposedly by English agents, which roused the anger of the French people. They realised that without Napoleon, the country would again be badly governed. On a poll of the whole population, 3,500,000 people voted Napoleon Bonaparte first consul for life. It was the first step towards the crown. Okay, so I'm going to leave it there. We've got a few pages to go, but we'll read those in another video. So I'm going to put this bookmark in here, and we'll come back to this again. This has been Kate at the Library of Whispers, saying I shall see you very soon. Bye bye for now. Bye bye.